Sarah, thank you very much indeed. And thank you to you and your team for putting together this fantastic conference. I'm really going to struggle here because I'm going to cover very similar ground as other people have done already in this session, but in no way the similar brilliant fashion that they have. So I apologize from the start for that. But we'll give it a go. So I'm Rob Palfrey. I'm the founder and the managing director of Minerva, and we are a social risk management consultancy. Our guiding mantra is that we do not have any of the answers, but we've got plenty of questions. We have got strong active listening skills, and we've got some pretty nifty tools for synthesizing that which we hear. And the point about that mantra is it's born from learning about and continuing to learn about operating in complexity. And I know this issue of complexity has come up endlessly and quite rightly so throughout the conference, but I just want to look at that in a little bit more detail. And the way that I want to do that is by using a case study of child labour in Uganda. This wasn't based around the mining sector, it was based around the agricultural sector, but I think child labour is something that people in mining can probably relate to, and it's an unfortunate disease that infects far too many sectors. I'm going to generally focus upon the social aspects for the sake of brevity as much as anything else. Okay. So what are we talking about when it comes to complexity? Well, I think the key thing that needs to be done is the words complexity and complicated are often used interchangeably, but for us, they are very different things. And so I've got that picture of the car there. Now a car is clearly a system. Is it complicated or is it complex? And I suspect everybody would instinctively say it is complicated. But I think it's useful just to think about, well, why is that complicated rather than complex? And it's complicated because I can know exactly how all of those parts fit together to make the system of the car. I don't, but I could do. And because I don't, I can go to a manual and I can read, and I can, with 100% confidence, assemble those parts together, and I will get a car and it will function in the way that a car is supposed to. And I can replicate that endlessly, again, with 100% confidence, because we have these linear cause and effect chains. And the system doesn't change its function, and the parts within the system just are not changed by being part of the system. They just do what they do. And finally, you can understand the system by breaking it down into constituent parts. You can see how it works. Okay, so if that's the complicated, then what is the complex? Well, again, instinctively, we all know what that is. But by way of simple example, a city traffic system is a complex system. The weather is a complex system. But breaking that down a little bit further, what are the characteristics that make it complex? Well, it's because the system becomes adaptive. The system is constantly changing. The function of the system is constantly changing. It may look steady state at certain levels, but within it, things are constantly in flux. And the parts are affected by what happens in the system, and the way in which the parts change then changes the system. It's that adaptive fact. It's dynamic. There tends to be lots more energy, lots more interactions, higher connectivity of parts within a complex system than within a complicated. Bring these together, you start to get the features of emergence. The old phrase, the system is greater than the sum of the parts. Maybe that's better expressed as the system is other than the sum of the parts. But the point is you cannot understand the system by just breaking it down into its individual parts. You can't analyze, you need to synthesize if you want to be able to see the forest for the trees. And then finally, that non-linear piece. And the key thing that comes out of that is because things are non-linear here, you get these tipping points where you keep doing the same thing and then suddenly something very different happens than has happened the last 100 times you've done exactly the same thing. And these are all the characteristics of the complex system as opposed to the complicated. Okay, so if that's correct, so what? Well, it matters because it matters how we operate in these situations. And there are different things that can happen. One thing that we quite often see that is happening is people don't even recognize the difference. And that's a problem in and of itself. The second thing that can happen is people can go, well, this is complex, we get it, and we get into this situation of paralysis by analysis. There's so much going on, there are so many different connections. How do we make sense of this? And the harder or the digger that we dig, the more lost we become. And then what we might end up doing is trying to use our tools that work in the complicated and bring them into the complex, and expect to be able to use those tools in a different way. And you know, so many miners on this, you will know far better than I that you've got to use the right tool for the right job. But all is not lost. There are things that we can do to operate in complex systems. And here are some key headlines. The first thing is really about this mindset, and so much of the things that I've heard Monica talking about, and Fabiano and Maria just this afternoon, all are about this different mindset. And it's in complicated systems, we can control things because we know the cause and effect, and we can put in control mechanisms. In complex scenarios, we need to think much more about how can we influence. Diversity, everybody knows that the value of diversity hits lots of different areas of any workplace, but the rubber can really hit the road in the complex system piece, because it starts to bring in different perspectives, different voices, different experiences. And if your company has the structures and the processes and the cultures that allow those voices to be heard, you can really start beginning to operate within a complex system. And if you bring together the mindset and the diversity, it gives you that flexibility. Danella Meadows, who was one of the pioneers in the field of complex adaptive systems, she used to talk about learning to dance with the system. And I think that encapsulates it so vividly of the way you have to approach this. And that can come from having things like the right mindset and and diversity in place. But the other overriding thing is context is king. And again, I'm aware that I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but you've got to start with the world as it is, not as you wish that the world was. And so context is absolutely everything in being able to ground your reality, and therefore what you do. Okay, that's sort of a lot of theory, but hopefully that gives you just the basis of explaining a little bit about our child labour issue in Uganda. So the background to this, we were brought into the project by a foundation who had made some of that mindset change. That was a really important start point, to be honest with you. They'd been operating in Uganda for over 10 years. They'd done some fabulous work and some fabulous achievements, but they were beginning to ask themselves about the boundaries to the work. They were asking themselves whether it was being as efficient as they could be, but much more importantly, whether it was being as effective as they could be, and whether they were just displacing child labour from their particular sector into another sector, and therefore not really generating any sustainable impact. So what did we do? Well, we came in to help them understand this, and we approached the problem viewing it as a complex adaptive system. And what we wanted to do is create a model by that, and from which we could then formulate responses. Now, the key is that those responses had to come from the stakeholders concerned. We couldn't provide the responses, we have none of the answers, but we could facilitate the identification of them. And again, I would focus upon responses rather than answers. Again, this is a complex adaptive system. This is not about finding the right answer. It's about finding different responses, trying things that will work, trying things that won't work and fail, and learning. And it's adapting with the system the whole time. It's never about just finding that one golden perfect answer. And again, we wanted to take the stakeholders on this complexity journey as we did this, so that they could then bring that into their own work. How do we do it? Usual thing. I started off with a bit of desk-based research, but all that was to do was to work out who we needed to talk to and what would be good questions to ask, and then get into the field and do that. And we used that to create this. Now, this is a causal loop diagram, and I don't expect you to make any sense of it, and I don't expect you to even be able to decipher it. But each of those bubbles on there is a key factor in its own right. And it's different ones that are on there are to do with social values, poverty at the top there, and that's broken down into poverty of different types of capital, economic factors are in there, the environment, migration, conflict, cultural factors, education, AIDS and other diseases, and the oil industry. And they were all important. And I'll come back to the oil industry because I think that has some useful knock-on effects. And then what we did with that model is it's only a model. It can only ever, it's got all the limitations, it's got all the errors you would expect in a model. But we then used that to run a workshop with all the stakeholders that we'd identified and had been involved in this, coming from the public, the private, the NGO, the civil society organization, their backgrounds in those organizations. And so we then ran different scenarios against that model to test the model and validate it, but also to then get the participants to work out what they would be contributing in those scenarios. And the important thing was not necessarily asking them what they were doing about child labour, but it was getting them to identify what they would be doing about their first order issues, those factors that I just mentioned, and then being able to say, well, look how that links through to child labour. Look how this links to these people over here and what they're doing. And ultimately that will have an impact, and it could be positive and it could be negative against child labour. And so the participants began to see the opportunity, the opportunities of collaborating with the person that they had, for the most part, only just met, and the threats of not collaborating with them. So where does that leave us? Well, what the participants recognized out of this is that they needed a coordinating mechanism, and that the foundation have now taken that on, and rather than that, they are developing their own contribution to becoming that coordination mechanism, rather than just wanting to do their raison d'etre, that by which they had previously existed for within the country. So they've adapted their own contribution rather than just concentrated on what is it that we do as an organization. They've allowed their findings to impact upon them. The engagement with the oil companies, I briefly want to touch upon. This is an ongoing thing, and one of the ways in which we're doing that is using their environmental and social impact assessments as the way in which to have a conversation with them and say, well, look, you've identified these things, you're acting upon this, whilst child labour is not particularly your issue. Again, look how you can collaborate. There's no blame in this. It's just bringing them into the room as well. Okay, and then finally, I'm not going to spend much time on this. I'm over time as it is. These were just some of the wider thoughts that perhaps one could take from the complex systems approach about this ESG at the strategic level, policy into practice, but also practice into policy, using some of the complexity thinking to do that. Corporate values, I'm not going to touch about. Elaine Dorward-King on day one spoke far better than I possibly could about this. My final point would just be upon leadership. If you want to do leadership, a command and control is brilliant in complicated scenarios where you have a hierarchy and you're aiming for efficiency. Leadership, when you're trying to operate in the complex environments, can look very different. And I think the concepts of teamship, creating psychological safe spaces, I've mentioned equality and diversity, bringing all of that in to your structures and how you think about what leadership actually is. And I think it should really be more about teamship is something that I would put out there as food for thought. And my apologies for running over.
And with that, I think Rob was getting to the end of his sentence there, unless, of course, it's my internet that has frozen slightly. Rose, if you want to let me know if you think it is me.
It is you. You are a black square. Oh, okay.
And I'm back. I think my internet froze slightly, did it? There we go. Always good, always good. We are having a thunderstorm here in the northeast of Scotland. This afternoon is our technical issues day, isn't it, Rose? But it's always good just to get it out of the way. Rob, thank you so much for that. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the wonderful Rob Palfrey. Thank you very, very much. That was brilliant.